Good morning, students. Today, let me begin by asking you a simple question. Do you think we can trust a stranger? Well, it's very difficult to trust an unknown person or a stranger. Today, we are going to study a lesson named Dusk, where we shall see how a man is cheated by a stranger. Now, let me give you a brief background of the story. Dusk is a short story written by the British author Hector Hugh Munro, popularly known as Saki. Saki was considered as one of the masters of short story writing. The story is named Dusk as all the actions of the story takes place at dusk. Dusk represents the time of those people who feel hopeless and dejected. It is also a time when the situation of suspense can be created, and it is the best time for the tricksters to befool others and escape without being caught. Now, this particular story, Dusk, has a plot where three characters and a situation of suspense revolve around a cake of soap. Okay, so now we are going to start with the lesson. Norman Godsby sat on a bench in the park with his back to a strip of grass fenced by the park railings and the row fronting him across a wide stretch of carriage drive. Hyde Park Corner, with its rattle and hoot of traffic, lay immediately to his right. It was some 30 minutes past 6 on an early March evening, and dusk had fallen heavily over the scene. Dusk mitigated by some faint moonlight and many street lamps. So, in the beginning of the story, we see Norman Godsby, the character of the story. He was sitting on a bench in the park and he was facing the carriage drive. Now, on his right lay the Hyde Park Corner, where he could see a lot of traffic and hear the loud sounds of the vehicles. It was around 6:30 on a March evening, and dusk had fallen heavily over the scene. But dusk was reduced by faint moonlight and street lamps. Next, let's continue. On the bench by his side sat an elderly gentleman with a drooping air of defiance that was probably the remaining vestige of self-respect in an individual who had ceased to defy successfully anybody or anything. His clothes could scarcely be called shabby. He belonged unmistakably to that forlorn orchestra to whose piping no one dances. Just beside Norman Godsby there sat an elderly gentleman. Now, Godsby was observing the gentleman and he realized that gentleman at one point of time used to be rebellious and challenging, but now gradually he had stopped resisting, and as if he had accepted defeat to himself and his life. Godsby felt that the man was wearing clothes which were quite neat, but it was not possible for him to lead a luxurious lifestyle. And he compared the old man to a forlorn orchestra, that is, somebody who is living a simple life and most of his days he is living unnoticed and unvalued. As he rose to go, Godsby imagined him returning to a home circle where he was snubbed and of no account, or to some bleak lodging where his ability to pay a weekly bill was the beginning and end of the interest he inspired. His retreating figure vanished slowly into the shadows, and his place on the bench was taken almost immediately by a young man, fairly well dressed but scarcely more cheerful of mien than his predecessor. Now, Godsby was observing this elderly gentleman. He imagined that this gentleman who rose to leave the place would return to a home which was a bleak, a desolate, poor lodging, and there nobody took care of him. Nobody would even take a notice of his return. Gradually, the old man's figure vanished into the darkness, and immediately his seat on the bench was occupied by a young man. This young man was also fairly dressed, well dressed, but somehow he was also not cheerful one. "You don't seem in a very good temper," said Godsby, judging that he was expected to take due notice of the demonstration. The young man turned to him with a look of disarming frankness which put him instantly on his guard. "You wouldn't be in a good temper if you were in the fix I'm in," he said. "I have done the silliest thing I have ever done in my life." "Yes?" said Godsby dispassionately. Now, when this young man came and sat beside Godsby, out of curiosity, just asked him that he didn't seem to be in a very good temper. His mood was not good. Now, Godsby had actually judged that person, that when that person came and sat beside him, he wanted to gain the attention of Godsby through various angry expressions. Now, the young man turned towards Godsby and answered him, telling that even Godsby would have been in a very bad mood if he was also in the same problem as that young man was in. And then he said he had done the silliest mistake of his life. Now, the young man says the problem he was in. He came up this afternoon meaning to stay at the Patagonian Hotel in Berkshire Square, continued the young man. When I got there, I found it had been pulled down some weeks ago and a cinema theatre run up on the site. The taxi driver recommended me to another hotel some way off, and I went there. I just sent a letter to my people giving them the address, and then I went out to buy some soap. I'd forgotten to pack any, and I hate using hotel soap. Then I strolled about a bit, looked at the shops, and when I came to turn my steps back to the hotel, I suddenly realized that I didn't remember its name or even what street it was in. There's a nice predicament for a fellow who hasn't any friends or connections in London. Of course, I can wire to my people for the address, but they won't have got my letter till tomorrow. This young man, he narrated his problem. What was his problem? That same afternoon, he had come up to London and intended to stay at the Patagonian Hotel in Berkshire Square. Now, when he reached there, he found that the hotel had been demolished and in its place stood a movie theatre. The taxi driver took him to another hotel. From there, he sent a letter to his relatives, out of town relatives and friends, telling them where he was staying, and then he went out to buy a soap for himself. Why do you think he required a soap in a hotel? First point, he said he had forgotten to pack his soap. And secondly, he hated using hotel soap. So after buying the soap, he took a drink and then he thought of going round the place. When he turned to return to the hotel, he realized he had forgotten the name and location of the hotel. And he was in a great difficulty. For he had no friends or acquaintances in London. He thought he could send a letter to his friends asking for help, but all in vain. Why? Because the out-of-town relatives and friends would also not receive the letter till the next day. The man continued with his narration. Meantime, I am without any money, came out with about a shilling on me, which went in buying the soap and getting the drink. And here I am, wandering about with 2 pence in my pocket and nowhere to go for the night. There was an eloquent pause after the story had been told. I suppose you think I have spun you rather an impossible yarn, said the young man presently, with a suggestion of resentment in his voice. Not at all impossible, said Godspeed judicially. I remember doing exactly the same thing once in a foreign capital, and on that occasion there were 2 of us, which made it more remarkable. Luckily, we remembered that the hotel was on a sort of canal, and when we struck the canal, we were able to find our way back to the hotel. Now, the young man continued to tell Godspeed that he had come out of the hotel with just a shilling, and so after buying the soap and having a drink, he was left with 2 pence in his pocket, and so for the night he had nowhere to go. Then he stopped for a moment and with a suggestion of resentment, that is, with a tone of bitterness in his voice, he told Godspeed if Godspeed had believed the story. Godspeed said that it was not an impossible story because the similar incident had once happened to him in his life. He had gone to a foreign capital with one of his friends, and there they had forgotten the location of the hotel. But somehow they remembered that the hotel was located on a canal, and so they easily could trace the canal and find the way back to the hotel. Let's see what happens next. The youth brightened at the reminiscence. In a foreign country, I wouldn't mind so much, he said. One could go to one's consul and get the requisite help from him. Here in one's own land, one is far more derelict if one gets into a fix. Unless I can find some decent chap to swallow my story and lend me some money, I seem likely to spend the night on the embankment. I'm glad, anyhow, that you don't think the story outrageously improbable. He threw a good deal of warmth into the last remark, as though, perhaps, to indicate his hope that Godspeed did not fall far short of the requisite decency. Of course, said Godspeed slowly. The weak point of your story is that you can't produce the soap. The young man sat forward hurriedly, felt rapidly in the pockets of his overcoat, and then jumped to his feet. I must have lost it, he muttered angrily. To lose hotel and a cake of soap in one afternoon suggests willful carelessness, said Godspeed. Now, this young man, when he heard the story of Godspeed's losing the hotel, he enjoyed that. And then immediately he said that if he would have been lost in a foreign capital, it would be easier for someone to get help. Why? because then one could visit his country's embassy and ask for help. And here, when one gets lost in his own land, it is difficult because there it's impossible to get help. And since he was penniless, for the night he had to spend on the bank of the river Thames. The man felt happy that Godsby had believed his story. But immediately Godsby remarked that the young man's story would have been a genuine one if he could have produced the soap. The young man searched for the soap in his pockets and then jumped to his feet, declaring that he must have lost it also. To this, Godsby remarked that it was the man's willful carelessness that led him to forget the hotel as well as the cake of soap. But the young man scarcely waited to hear the end of the remark. He flitted away down the path, his head held high, with an air of somewhat jaded jauntiness. It was a pity, mused Godsby. The going out to get one's own soap was the one convincing touch in the whole story. And yet, it was just that little detail that brought him to grief. If he had had the brilliant forethought to provide himself with a cake of soap, wrapped and sealed with all the solicitude of the chemist's counter, he would have been a genius in his particular line. In his particular line, genius certainly consists of an infinite capacity for taking precautions. Now, this young man, he did not even wait to hear the end of the remarks made by Godsby. He just flitted away. That is, he moved quickly with light steps, with his head held high, and somewhat he lacked confidence now. Godsby thought that it was a pity. Now, even though the story of forgetting the name of his hotel and buying a soap would have been a true one, but his inability to produce the soap just washed away all the efforts of the young man to befool Godsby. Now, Godsby was happy that he was able to judge the person as a fraud one. With that reflection, Godsby rose to go. As he did so, an exclamation of concern escaped him. Lying on the ground by the side of the bench was a small oval packet, wrapped and sealed with the solicitude of a chemist's counter. It could be nothing else but a cake of soap, and it had evidently fallen out of the youth's overcoat pocket when he flung himself down on the seat. Now, Godsby was very happy that he had judged the person carefully and he could save himself from being befooled. And then he thought of leaving the place. As he rose to go, he found a small oval packet lying beside the bench on the ground. And then he was guilt-stricken. Why? Because now he could realize that it was the same soap of the young man that had fallen from his overcoat pocket. In another moment, Godsby was scudding along the dusk-shrouded path in anxious quest for a youthful figure in a light overcoat. He had nearly given up the search when he caught sight of the object of his pursuit, standing irresolutely on the border of the carriage drive, evidently uncertain whether to strike across the park or make for the bustling pavements of Knightsbridge. He turned round sharply with an air of defensive hostility when he found Godsby hailing him. "The important witness to the genuineness of your story has turned up," said Godsby, holding out the cake of soap. "It must have slid out of your overcoat pocket when you sat down on the seat. I saw it on the ground after you left. You must excuse my disbelief, but appearances were really rather against you. Now, as I appealed to the testimony of the soap, I think I ought to abide by its verdict. If the loan of sovereign is any good to you." The young man hastily removed all doubt on the subject by pocketing the coin. So, Godsby found the soap and he immediately ran after the young man. He looked for the man here and there, ultimately noticing him standing on the border of the carriage drive. On seeing the young man, Godsby called out to him, and then, going near him, he produced the important witness to the genuineness of the man's story. Now, what is the important witness here? The soap. On finding the soap, the truth of the man's story was proved. And then Godsby apologized to the young man for his earlier remarks and not believing him. Then he gave the young man a loan of a sovereign. The young man immediately took the coin and put it inside his pocket. "Here is my card with my address," continued Godsby. "Any day this week will do for returning the money. And here is the soap. Don't lose it again. It's been a good friend to you." "Lucky thing you're finding it," said the youth. Then, with a catch in his voice, he blurted out a word or two of thanks and walked headlong in the direction of Knightsbridge. "Poor boy," he as nearly as possible broke down, said Godsby to himself. I don't wonder whether the relief from his quandary must have been acute. It's a lesson to me not to be too clever in judging by circumstances. As Godsby retraced his steps past the seat where the little drama had taken place, he saw an elderly gentleman poking and peering beneath it and on all sides of it, and recognized his earlier fellow occupant. "Have you lost anything, sir?" he asked. "Yes, sir, a cake of soap." Well, now we come towards the end of the story. So, Godsby had given this man a loan of a sovereign. Along with it, he also handed over to him his card, which had Godsby's address and also the soap. While handing over the soap to the young man, Godsby advised him to keep the soap carefully, for the soap had been a good friend to him. Rather, the soap had only allowed Godsby to offer that loan of a sovereign to the young man. The young man took the card and the soap and immediately left the place. Godsby wondered if that amount could have really been enough to bring the man out of his problem. He also learned a lesson that he should not be too hasty in judging by circumstances. Then he decided to walk back to the bench in the park. When he returned there, he found his fellow occupant, a previous one, that elderly gentleman, He was searching for something in and around the bench. On asking the old gentleman if he had lost anything, the old man replied, "Yes, a cake of soap." So here you find the author is ending the story on a note of surprise. Now let's recapitulate the story once. Norman Godsby was sitting on a bench in Hyde Park in London at dusk. An elderly gentleman who sat beside Godsby seemed to be a very lonely and ignored person. After the elderly man left, his seat was occupied by a young man who tried to gain the attention of Godsby through angry expressions. Godsby came to know from the young man that the man had gone out to buy his soap after checking in at a hotel, and when he turned to return, he realized he had forgotten the name and location of the hotel. Next, Godsby had once been in the same situation in a foreign land, and so initially he believed the young man's story. Godsby then told the young man that his story could have been believed had he successfully produced the soap as an evidence to the story. The young man was angry at his misfortune of having lost the only evidence to prove his story and walked away unhappily. Godsby rose to get up when he saw a small oval packet lying on the ground beside the bench. Godsby felt guilty at being too hasty in judging the young man. Next, immediately Godsby ran behind the man, apologized for his disbelief, and offered him a sovereign as a loan. Godsby also gave his address and the cake of soap he had found to the young man. Soon after the young man left, thanking him, Godsby felt sad for the boy and decided never to judge people hastily in future. As Godsby returned to his bench in the park, he found the previous occupant, the elderly man, looking around for something. On asking him, Godsby came to know that he was looking for a cake of soap. Now, let me discuss the speciality of the ending of the story. The short story Dusk by Saki has a surprise ending. I told you when I completed the reading of the lesson that the story ends on a note of surprise. Now see why the story is having a surprising end. It is because the author makes Norman Godsby realize that the cake of soap had not belonged to the young man, but it belonged to the elderly gentleman. Godsby was befooled by the false story of the young man. I hope you have understood the story. Thank you.